At 11:38 a.m. on January the 28th, 1986, the Space Shuttle Challenger lifted off from Launch Pad 39B at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. 73 seconds into flight, it disintegrated in a cloud of blazing rocket fuel, and everyone on board was killed. The book that I wrote about what happened that morning is the second I've written about a technological catastrophe, and also the second dealing with something that happened in the first few months of 1986. This isn't because I have a ghoulish fascination with disasters, and certainly not because I have any wish to endlessly relive the year I turned 18. But one thing the events have in common is the opportunity they present to examine human nature at its best and its worst. The stories of Chernobyl and Challenger are full of heroes and villains. People are both precipitated and reacted to what happened in often startling ways, and others who tried to stand in the way of disaster and suffered the consequences for the rest of their lives. Tonight, I want to tell you a story about one of those people, a rocket engineer named Roger Beaujolais, and how I came to learn about what happened to him. When I first began to think about writing about Challenger at the end of 2019, I realized that what I remembered about the accident and the way I remembered it was only a fraction of the story. I remembered Krista McAuliffe, I remembered the cold weather, and I remembered the O-rings. But I didn't really know very much about the other 6 members of the crew, or what had brought them to the launch pad that day. And I knew nothing at all about the senior managers at NASA who had effectively sent the crew to their deaths, or the engineers like Roger Beaujolais, who worked at Morton Thiokol, the company that built the booster rockets that caused the accident. Beaujolais was one of a handful of engineers at Thiokol who had been worried for months about problems with the seals in the rockets, the O-rings. And the night before Challenger launched, called a last-minute meeting with their bosses at NASA to try to stop the countdown. Beaujolais insisted that if they launched in cold weather, there was a strong chance that the O-rings would fail and all the astronauts would be killed. And although I knew that Roger was a central protagonist in the story, he had died in 2012. I had very little information about who he was or where he'd come from. One of the first things I did when I started my research was call Joe Trento, who was a retired CNN correspondent who'd written a book about Challenger published in the immediate aftermath of the accident in 1987. Joe had interviewed almost all of the senior managers at NASA and had made the decision to launch Challenger, but many of whom had died long ago. I wanted to ask Joe if he still had the transcripts of those conversations, but when I got him on the phone, Joe said, "Well, no, I don't, because I've donated everything I had to the archives of the National Air and Space Museum in Chantilly, Virginia. But if you call them, I'm sure they'll let you see them." So I emailed the archives of the National Air and Space Museum in Chantilly, Virginia, and I asked about Joe's papers. The archivist wrote straight back and said, "Sure, you can come and take a look at them as soon as we reopen." By now, it was October 2020, and the reading rooms of every federal archive in the country had closed down because of COVID-19. 2 years later, I finally managed to get an appointment to visit. But before I went, I called to find out how long they thought I would need to go through the transcripts. The archivist kindly pulled the boxes and told me there were just 3 cartons and a few files of transcripts. If you come down for 2 days, that should be fine. And when I got down there, I could see she was absolutely right. There wasn't much there at all, a handful of flimsy pages printed out in dot matrix type more than 30 years ago. The ink of much of it so faded as to be almost illegible. I was finished in a few hours. So I had a whole day left. But then I'm bearing in mind Robert Caro's famous dictum, "Turn every page." So I sat down and laboriously began going through every single document in the remainder of the 3 boxes. Then, halfway through day 2, right at the end of one box, I found a small padded envelope. Inside it was a transparent jewel case containing an unmarked CD. Now, this disc was from sometime in the 90s, so at least 20 years old. The likelihood of there being anything useful on it or even it being in a format that was readable in the 21st century, seemed slim at best. But I thought it was worth a try, so I went to the archivist and I said, Elizabeth, this is probably a total waste of time, but you think you could have a look at this and see if there's anything recoverable in it? And she said, sure. Why don't you go to lunch, I'll hand it over to the IT guys, and we'll see what we can do. So I went to the museum cafeteria, got myself a sandwich, came back half an hour later. And when I came back, I said, Elizabeth, don't suppose there was any luck with that CD? And she said, oh yeah, go down to that computer at the end of the room. We pulled something off it you might be interested in. So I went and sat down, and on the screen was a Word document. It was 600 pages long. And it was not what I'd been looking for at all. It was a memoir written by Roger Beaujolais, finished in 1999 and never published. It turns out that Beaujolais had been a pack rat and had kept every scrap of paper related to his career at Morton Thiokol and the Challenger accident. And when he left work at the company, he stuffed his Toyota Celica with 14 cardboard boxes filled with company memos and test reports, and his own engineering logbooks, a day-by-day diary of everything he had done at work and how he felt about it. He used this material to write a book in which he described himself as a raging introvert, a man who had spent his entire life dedicated to engineering. He wrote about how he had arrived at Thiokol at the beginning of the space shuttle program and eventually learned more about the joints in the solid rockets than anyone else at the company. He described witnessing 4 years of shuttle launches and seeing signs of damage in the rubber rings that sealed the joints of the rocket get worse and worse. He wrote about how he had spent months trying to persuade his bosses at Thiokol to take the problem seriously and do something about it before it was too late. And he described that teleconference the night before the launch and how desperate he was to have the launch stopped. But he also revealed exactly why he felt so determined to stop the Challenger countdown going ahead. It was because he understood the personal consequences of not doing so better than anyone else in the room. A dozen years earlier, Beaujolais had been working at Rockwell International in California, a company that he described as being at the time the armpit of the aerospace industry, where he was helping to build what would ultimately become the crew compartment of the space shuttle. One day in 1974, Beaujolais found himself getting into an argument with a normally mild-mannered colleague from the structural design department. The argument eventually became so heated that Beaujolais was worried that they would come to blows, and afterwards, he was so upset by what had happened that he went to his supervisor to find out what the story was. And his supervisor said, "Haven't you heard?" Then he explained that before coming to Rockwell, the other engineer had worked on the design of a new jumbo jet, the DC-10. Specifically, he had been assigned to the plane's cargo bay door design. But as time went by, he became concerned that there was a fault with the design, making it possible for the door to come open unexpectedly in flight. He appealed to his bosses to fix the problem, but they wouldn't listen. Eventually, he became so concerned that he went to the FAA and asked them to refuse to certify the aircraft design until it was fixed. But they wouldn't listen either, and the DC-10 went into service just as it was. 3 years after that, in March 1974, a DC-10 operated by Turkish Airlines, Flight 981, took off from Orly Airport in Paris with a full complement of passengers and crew bound for London. It was just 9 minutes into flight, at a height of around 11,500 feet, when the rear cargo door came open. An explosive decompression severed the cables connecting the cockpit to the engines and the control surfaces, and the plane plunged into a forest in rural France at nearly 500 miles an hour. There were no survivors. It was, at the time, the deadliest crash in civil aviation history. Afterwards, Beaujolais' colleague was medicated to cope with the trauma of what happened. but he remained tortured by his failure to stop an accident he knew was inevitable. And he felt personally responsible for the deaths of 346 men, women, and children. Roger Beaujolais left Rockwell not long after that, but he swore that wherever he worked from that point onwards, he would never allow himself to be put in the same position as that engineer. The night before the Challenger launch, Beaujolais at first succeeded in persuading his bosses at Morton Thiokol to tell NASA that they would not recommend the countdown proceed. It was a no-go for launch. But NASA managers said his argument about the O-rings and the cold weather was inconclusive. He didn't have the data. It was just a hunch. And they made it clear that they wanted to go ahead with the launch regardless. One of them said, "My God, Thiokol, when do you expect me to launch? Next April?" At that, Beaujolais felt his stomach lurch. He remembered Flight 981. He tried everything he could to stop his bosses buckling under the pressure. He picked up a handful of glossy photographs showing the damage to the O-rings the last time the shuttle had launched in such cold weather. He slapped them down on the table in front of his managers to get their attention, but they ignored him. He lost his composure completely and began screaming at them at the top of his voice. He began to fear that he would be fired on the spot. But they still wouldn't listen. In the end, he fell silent and went back to his seat. Then he watched one by one as the 4 men changed their launch recommendation from no-go to go. When he heard that, Beaujolais was terrified that they had just taken the decision to kill 7 astronauts. As he left the room that night, his colleagues tried to tell him that he had done everything he could. And although he hoped for the best, he still feared the worst. The next morning, he reluctantly sat down on the floor of the Thiokol conference room to watch the launch take place live on television. And as the terminal countdown began, he reached out to the man sitting next to him and held his hand.